Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the weekly live stream for the Restitutor Orbis channel. I am your host, Lucius Aurelian, and I'd like to extend a greeting to all explorers, prime explorers, and viewers joining us. I thought that today being the solstice day, as Kathy nicely mentioned in the comments there, that it would be a great time to talk about resets. What are the concepts of resets, and why do resets matter? What's important about resets, and why are resets, yes, I'm repeating the word a lot, there's a reason for it. Just stay with me. Why are resets one of the fundamental theories, one of the pillars, if you will, of alternative research, or explaining the very existence of the old world, or the civilization that we call Tartaria? Now, what exactly is a reset? What can a reset do? How does it work? Is it controlled? Is it uncontrolled? Is it part of a schedule? Is it something that people can pull with strings? Or is it something that just happens? All of these things may be true. None of these things may be true. Although, frankly, I'm of the mindset that all of them are true, and there's different degrees of resets. But what I thought we would do is we would go through and look at the different types of resets and then talk about how they apply, not just in the five eras theory, but also how they apply with understanding how an old world or a civilization that came before ours, we are completely unaware of it. Because if you think about it, the reset theory actually explains all those different concepts. It also explains the sense of dysphoria that we have as an entire people. Now, this little image that I picked, I think it represents the reset very well. It's the classic image, actually, the more modern computer produced image of what is considered fire and brimstone. And if you're someone who is raised religious or not, perhaps you've heard the term. It's fire and brimstone. Well, if you think on what it's really designed to do or what it's stated to do, whether you're reading it in the Bible or any of the other great holy books or any of that sort of publication, you'll realize that fire and brimstone is the very original concept of the reset. Now, yes, of course, there's the more obvious concept of the flood, and we'll get to that. But I thought starting with fire and brimstone is interesting because if you look at this image, you sort of get the idea of all the things that we encounter, the great fires, the mud floods. What exactly were those? And we have many different theories behind them. And yet, when we look across the lands, we can see the effects of different types of resets. We can speculate or theorize that maybe it was a flood. Maybe it was, as KC933 just said, dragons, fire and brimstone, dragons. Yes, that's just as relevant of a theory as any other. But it all falls into play because we're trying to explain why we're in the situation that we're in and what did it really do to bring about this world. Now, with the five eras theory, I find it very interesting to use this to depict, to show how we have each of these breaks between the eras. Now, you see that we have our five eras here, and then we have this dotted line that represents the reset. Now, granted, as part of the theory, not knowing, again, going off of the accepted official chronological timeline. Of course, as I've told you, I'm not really confident now in how the timeline unfolds even prior to 1940. As I've done more of these explorations, I will admit that my confidence in the timeline from 1900 to 1940 has diminished. Does that mean that those events didn't happen? No. But does that mean that I think there's a lot of questions with those events? Absolutely. And that's why there is this uncertainty with when the last hard reset occurred. Now, I say hard reset. What do I mean by that? When I'm talking about a hard reset, I'm talking about the entire world or the land, or however you want to think of it as, this reality being completely changed. The civilization, the society, not just that, but also the way we operate and think. And maybe even our very physical beings could have been changed in ways that we don't understand between each of these eras as a result of these resets. And so, what we're going to get after tonight is really looking, or day, or wherever you are. I know many of you are joining us from other parts of the land, and that's wonderful. But what we're going to get after right now is how these resets can happen. We're also going to look at the different types of resets because it's not just a hard reset where the entire land is completely reordered or changed. There's also the smaller types of resets, smaller resets that can happen within an era, or smaller resets that can happen right after your hard reset. You might remember one of the prime theories that we have on the channel is the concept of conflict, assimilation, indoctrination. Yes, oddly enough, those 3 letters. And those 3 factors coming into play after the hard reset between the 4th and the 5th era. And what they were doing is they were establishing this current order that we have. And oddly enough, you can still see it being played out to this day. That's one way to view things. It's not the only way. Remember that this is theory and it's conjecture. I was not alive in 1850 to witness events, but you'd be surprised how many people I have in the comments who assure me that they were or they knew someone who was alive in 1850. Don't ask me how that's possible, but there are people that say it. But we're going to look through it and we're going to gain an understanding of the difference between these large-scale resets that divide eras, in theory, and the smaller resets that occur within an era. Now, I also always say, I don't know that there's 5 eras. There could be many more. Or it could just be one era that has a bunch of smaller resets and they could be perceived as different types of resets. But thoughts on that so far? Adam, yes, I was on Old World Exploration's great channel last evening, and we discussed that. And who knows, maybe that was just a series of micro resets, as we might call them. So, nah. Well, that could be true too, Nana. I mean, multi-dimensional space. Maybe that's how you explain the rapid reordering of things in a very short timeline, for all we know. So what are some concepts that we have of the hard reset, the large-scale reset? One of the terms that you'll hear used by many alternative researchers, and one that I've seen and one that I've seen suggested, is the concept of the plasma fire, or again, the fire and brimstone, rocks coming from the skies. Now, what's really interesting is regardless of which sort of perception you have, whether you agree more with the mainstream or you take the alternative researcher perception, oddly enough, there is a theory that accompanies this. So the mainstream, we could be hit by giant asteroids. We could be hit by meteorites. There'd be a meteor shower. There was that great film with Sean Connery where they dealt with it in the 1970s. There were all those disaster films. But is it possible that in any sort of mindset that we could have rocks or something that comes from the sky that utterly destroys a civilization? And it's not a controlled event. It's some sort of natural event that occurs on the cycle, a cycle that we may not understand, but perhaps there's somebody else or something else, thinking outside the limitations of human existence here, that is aware of this cycle. And they know when this tremendous destructive event is going to occur. And events are prepared accordingly to attend to that, to reach certain ends. Now, the question would be, well, why would anybody do this? Well, it's a great question. And we'll answer it by starting small and working to a larger scale reset. That's how we'll answer the question. But right now, considering it, the most dramatic form is thinking about how a civilization could be destroyed. Now, did anybody ever see any of those wonderful films from the 90s when they got back to disaster films? Deep Impact or Armageddon, that was probably the example of it, where they were talking about things coming from the sky, whether it's a comet or an asteroid, it doesn't matter. It smashes into the land, the planet, however you want to think of it as, and it completely destroys the civilization. Is that a recurring theme that we have in many times and places? There's a good one right there, Lawrence. Astrological epochs or cycles. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to try to introduce you to some different epochs or cycles that you may not be familiar with, because believe me, there is a lot of them out there. Many different ones. Oh, thanks, Kathy. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's real. The disaster film franchise was kind of interesting. It was big in the 70s. It made a bit of a comeback in the 90s, and now it's hit or miss. Although that director, Roland Emmerich, his films get, how shall we say, more interesting each time he makes one. I'm not going to say anything about Moonfall, and I'll just leave it at that. So, yeah, I would agree with that, Jared. I mean, Deep Impact seemed to take a very realistic, hard look at things. Armageddon was a little bit more of your classic action flick where we had Bruce Willis being his Bruce Willis best. And it's an enjoyable movie, but Deep Impact was really looking more at the human factor of it. So, Sissy, some events happened about the same time, but the narrative givers, that's a good term, I'll have to remember that one, spread these events to add years to our history. And that's entirely possible as well. Yes, Vaughn, good example. Greenland, much more recent example too. And don't forget the lesson you learned from that film. Don't go to Warner Robins when you're trying to get away from an impending natural disaster. Okay, that's a joke. It's a really bad one. But, yes, Kathy, the movie 2012, I think we mentioned that last week. So, So there's many, many different examples in films of all the different types of resets. And there is no shortage of this hard reset that we have with complete destruction. And you'll find no shortage of images of what it may look like, how terrifying it can really be. And then, of course, there's the old classic, the end of the world image, the end of the world dream that everybody is stated to have at some point in their lives, where they see massive fire utterly destroying the land. Yet, oddly enough, when we think about all the times that we encounter massive fires, past, present, or future even, whether it's a wildfire or whether it's a specific location fire, I'm not going to talk about any cathedrals today, but I think you're following what I'm saying. And we think about how we all seem to have this, I don't want to say collective fear, but collective awareness, if you will. Everybody seems to have this dream at some point in time, and I know there's always exceptions, and I'm not speaking for everybody, but everybody you talk to will tell you. And if anybody wants to deny that right now, go ahead. If there's anybody out there who didn't have a dream or a fear somewhere in the back of their mind about utter destruction and total annihilation, let me know now. Share it in the comments. Hey, I am Kairos. Thanks for joining us. Oh, the final experiment was rigged. Yeah, that's very true. So it's not rigged. Well, two schools of thought on it. We'll look at both. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There's evidence for both, as always. So, Nana, we are just a decade short of the next micronova, which will dump us into the Stone Age. Yeah, who knows? And that's always the other thing, is people are trying to predict when the next event's going to happen. And you'll see no shortage of comments about that either. And maybe some people do know. I remember back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when Elizabeth Clara Prophet thought that she knew a nuclear war was going to happen. That didn't go so well for her. But, it is an example. We're always trying to be aware of what's happening and what may be coming around the corner. So, Sharknado. Oh, yeah. You could say that was a reset for the quote-unquote sci-fi channel, or going from SCIFI to SYFI. That's a reset too. So anyway, but moving on, and let's go, and we're going to shift gears now to talk about the types of reset. So we've got our large-scale reset that completely destroys the land. It completely annihilates everything. There's also some very interesting artwork, and I think you've all figured out that I have a little bit of an affinity for artwork, especially, human done artwork. Nothing against computer aided artwork. It's got its place too. But, my particular affinity is for human artwork because I feel it captures something. And there's actually a lot of artwork, not just from the Middle Ages or what we're informed as the Middle Ages, but from more recent times, 1930, 1940, already coming up on 100 years ago, that there was artwork that displayed what this may have looked like, where you see all this unbelievable suffering. And, a lot of people associate this with religious meaning, and it can have that association, but it also has the association with other things that are happening, other things that may be a more direct sign of the times. Now, let me ask you this question. Did anybody see the film The Mist? When did that come out? That was what, late 2000s with Thomas Jane. And yes, it was based on a Stephen King novella, and you've got some Stephen King artwork featured at the beginning of it, but what's intriguing about that is it shows you that when suddenly people have events that suddenly occur that they're not used to dealing with, how it affects them psychologically. And then you even see the ability of some people to, dare I say, exploit the fear in people's minds. All that's in that little movie. It's a wonderful little movie, I thought, and didn't really get a lot of attention, at least not as much as I thought it deserved. So I am Kairos. Runaway spending in debt suggests they know a big change is coming. Possibly. Or do they have any limits with it? Is that not what they've always been doing? So anyway, but back to the Mist analogy, and that's the beauty about film, is they do show this happening in films. They don't seem to have any reluctance showing this, and they being Hollywood, the producers, whoever's putting these films together. But they always show you this. They give you this idea that there's going to be some horrific event, and this type of reset is something that you need to fear. And that's always the first emotion. Fear. Internal fear, existential fear, the end of your physical existence. And let's be honest, how much of us are reminded every day, every second of every day, that our physical existence is limited? And suddenly you find out that this whole concept of the end of the world plays into that fear very directly. Only, maybe some people in a morbid sense would say you could take comfort because you're not going to face it alone. And a lot of people fear that transition alone. But, and some people could even say death itself for the individual is a type of reset. I mean, who knows? I don't know the answers to those questions. And maybe that's beyond this exploration. But simply talking about the effect on the mind and the psychological effect. Because what happens when people are afraid? Do people become more susceptible to authority, to mandates, to dictates when they're afraid? Thoughts? Yes. Good example there. And Vaughn. Yeah, well, you know what? We're going to look at some of those, although not the most obvious ones, but I will agree. Yeah, there's places in China where you can really see it. Where's that comment? I missed that, Heidi. Hold on. Heidi, plan to control people. And if you think about that, that's something that's recursory. That happens over and over again. And any of us who've been alive and remember our lives from over 10 years have seen multiple examples of that. So, yes. Good one there, Robert. Exactly. The Patriot Act, many of them. But it's nothing new. That's been happening for all of our recorded history. At least that's what we've been informed. Yes, Adam. Afraid of our own mortality because it's something that can be exploited. And that's what you tend to see with it. Oh, this is an interesting comment. What if each person is living in their own reality and this world is a reflection of their inner state? When they change internally, their world changes as well. Absolutely. Is that real or is that merely a perception? That's what we could argue. So, but it is a good point. Maybe it does with the individual reality. We all have our own reality. I see it differently than Robert does. Robert sees it differently than I do. But going back to the type of reset and staying on track here, because believe me, I really want to go off and talk about these things, but I'm going to try to stay focused. You think about how these types of resets go, because these are the big resets, the ones where we see massive destruction and our entire civilization, our society being destroyed. And then if you're lucky enough to survive, everything you know is gone, and then you've got to face the fear of the unknown. It's the old apocalyptic film trope. The good examples being the classic Mad Max films. I'm not going to say anything about the current two. They're okay, but I always thought the classic ones did a better job. Always playing on that fear of how everything in society would instantly change. Now, just to give an example of how the very shape and the physical face of the land may have been changed, I show you this image. It's one of these lovely postcards from Barstow, California. Now, Barstow, California, it's in the middle of the Mojave Desert. It's just south of Death Valley a ways. It's right off of I-15, Interstate 15, the main and primary route between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And it's packed with traffic every Friday and every Sunday without fail. Oh, and on certain holidays. Don't ever try driving back after Thanksgiving. And by the way, if you're there now, don't try driving it right after this coming holiday, if you follow me. Anyways, what you see there, though, in Barstow, which is it's a medium-sized town, it's right off of I-15, is they had this train station there. And oddly enough, when you look at this train station, that of course was constructed in the early 1900s, because when else would it be? Why would anybody build an opulent train station like this in Barstow? Of course, we know the usual discussion. You have the signs, though, in this town that's just in the middle of the desert that people can't drive through fast enough. And of course, the joke is California is never going to build another parallel interstate between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Why would they do that? They have no reason to do that. And that's actually a decision that makes sense, at least from that perspective. But what's always interesting to me about this area is when you look at the terrain associated with it. A lot of people overlook the terrain, the land in Death Valley and in the Mojave Desert. And here's your classic image of it. It is it looks like it's been subjected to some very terrifying forces. And indeed, there's some Native American tribal accounts from the area that say that very thing, that entire land was completely scorched by some sort of force that we can't even begin to understand. And if you actually look closer at the hills and if you look at some of the terrain features there, it very much gives you that impression. And let me assure you that if you're actually driving through it, that place can be a lot more mentally oppressive than you can begin to imagine. And so that's some of your evidence of this hard reset going on, this plasma fire theory that we have. And you can really take any desert, you can take many different areas in the land and find great examples of it. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there's lots of places in the Middle East, Felix. I mean, like I said, it's all over the place. I mean, yeah, I could find some more definitive examples looking at places near the Dead Sea and so on and so forth. But, it's also in places where people aren't even expecting to see it. Why is it that we have deserts in some areas where it doesn't make a lot of sense from the topographical or the latitude location, and yet in other places we do? So, very, very strange. Oh, that's a good one, Robert. Electric attack. Yeah. And that's the other question. Do we really know, are these events something that are natural events or are they artificial? Was it some kind of weapon that we can't even begin to understand that was employed at that time? Hey, Joshua, good one with the Dust Bowl. Yes, absolutely. And, how much of an area was really affected by that? That's always the strange thing. Isle of California. Yes. Was it an island at some point in time? Do we know? We just don't know. And reality checkmate, liquefied. Absolutely. So all those possibilities, all those different ways of physical destruction. And then, of course, you can find some of the actual biblical imagery, showing you the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and what actually transpired with that. You can look at all the research and even the more current research that says that we've located Sodom and Gomorrah. What happened with his spouse turning into a pillar of salt. Was there reality to that? Or was that just some story, a myth designed to induce fear? Or was it not an allegory? Was it completely real and to be taken literal? And of course, I'll leave that to you to decide. But it is interesting to look at it from either perspective because it does have a very profound effect. And not just this story, but any story behind it. And then the more well-known quote unquote flood myth. Although every single society, every civilization just happens to have some sort of flood myth at a different time. Even going back to the old days of Sumer, very intriguing, or Sumeria, and the early Babylonians, they had flood myths too. By the way, does anybody out there know which society culture does not have a declared flood myth, if any? Vaughn, I tend to think there are many truths in ancient bibliography. Probably right, Vaughn. Many truths and many allusions to truth. Punchy, I remember those claims of finding Sodom and Gomorrah, claim that was nearly pure sulfur embedded in the bricks. Well, and you got to say this, the terrain where they found that, it definitely matches up with it, beyond any shadow of a doubt. So, may sound crazy, but sometimes I wonder if it's the way the roads are that we never even notice that if it's an island or not, if that makes sense. Actually, UNLV, that makes a lot of sense. And you're getting at something that I'm going to look at here with everybody about the roads, because there's actually a major indicator with the roads. So, but anyways, so whether you're talking a flood, a plasma fire, something coming from the sky, and, here we're talking about massive rain, but it could also be a tsunami of some sort. You also look at some of this older artwork where you get this impression that the people really were in a total state of fear. They were really breaking down. And oddly enough, it's that same theme that you see reflected in many films. It's the theme of the concept of the individual breaking down that you witnessed if you watched the film The Mist, going back to the Thomas Jane film from the late 2000s. You see this happening, though. Now, is that to say that the authority that people are putting their trust and faith in is legitimate? Or what if that authority itself was compromised? See, that's what we don't know about the past. And I'm not talking anything about contemporary events. Again, I leave that to you to decide, but what was going on in the distant past? Now, the official history tells us that at some point in time, previous governments, previous institutions, they were corrupt in many different ways, shapes, and forms. But is that really an allusion to what was actually happening with the civilization that preceded ours? Had their leadership, had their institutions become corrupt? And then you had all these people who were suddenly breaking down to their own fear, and now they were putting their trust in these corrupt institutions. Is that what's being shown? Is that what's really in this myth of these legends? It seems to be, but again, it's up to you to decide. There's also some really interesting artwork that you have that's a little bit more abstract. And, I find abstract art interesting too, because you can take different conclusions from it. And it talks about, or maybe I shouldn't say it that way, it's interpreted as it's showing the way that reality can shift and change. Now, does anybody remember, or is anybody familiar with Tolkien's work and how he lined out the works of the ages and how Arda changed? Arda, what he called the world, Middle Earth. Remember, Middle Earth was just a small part of Arda, Tolkien's overall world. We'll take a look at that as well. But when I see artwork like this, it reminds me of that. It reminds me of how the very physical nature of everything is suddenly changing. How different could the eras that came before us have really been? And I think that's something we don't fully understand. We're informed that in the distant past, well, of course, the land was very different. No, there wasn't even oxygen everywhere. There wasn't water. The planet was covered, planet land. It was covered with lava. It was covered with this or that. It was completely different. There was a supercontinent. But was that really in the distant past as we think? Oh, that's a good one, Vaughn. I knew this place was Tatooine. Yeah, maybe. Maybe. We just don't know. But you see the other interesting thing, and I think Sodom and Gomorrah always caught my attention because of the fact that that particular tale is also embraced by the mainstream, and even the claim that yes, it may have well really happened. So I've always found that fascinating. Now, going on to some other film examples where you probably see a reset. One of the best films, I think, that shows what we think of as a reset is Logan's Run, 1976, Michael York, Jenny Agutter. I've covered it before on the channel, but the opening scene of the film, you have these gigantic dome cities, and then you actually see the interior of the dome city, and you realize that something's happened. Now, in the film, it doesn't make it clear what's happened. You have the computer that runs this dome city that tells Logan, the main character, that there was a cataclysm that occurred. And that's all you know. Even the computer doesn't really know what happens. It just says cataclysm. And everyone in the dome, they get to live a nice, pleasurable life until the age of 30, and then they go to Carousel. I recommend it. Watch it if you want to. But it's a great example, though, of a reset. That cataclysm was a hard reset. And what changed after the reset? The entire civilization changed. And later in the film, when Logan conducts his mission and goes outside of the city, one of the very first people to ever do so and survive, he sees the ruins of Washington, D.C. And I always found it ironic that, of course, all the buildings that survived are what we consider old world buildings. Now, yes, I know this is special effects in 1976, but you get the idea. Oh, yes, the old guy they find. That's right. Old man. Played by Peter Ustinov. Quite an interesting character himself. So, yeah, Adam says it. Biodome. Oddly enough, another little concept that they recycled a little bit in the 1990s as well. Ah, yes, Sean. I do have to cover Planet of the Apes at some point in time. No doubt inspired by it, too. And really the whole film. And I'm always amazed at how the main theme of the film gets by so many people. Dr. Zaius was right. Oh, no. Dr. Zaius was wrong. Dr. Zaius was just as wrong as Dr. Haslund. But we'll get to it when we get to it. But I found it interesting because the main characters, they actually have this question. I wonder what they were like, Logan and Jessica, when they actually look at what we think is the Lincoln Memorial or whatever it actually was, And it's the same question that we ask. When we look at the old world architecture, we ask the same question. I wonder what they were like, because they have no idea. They didn't even know that there was a civilization outside the city. In fact, he didn't even know, she didn't even know there was a world outside of the city. They thought the city, that entire dome, was their entire world. There's a wonderful scene where they look at the sun for the first time and he puts his hand up to it and he says, "It's warm. I have no idea what it is." It's very interesting. And I think that's something that's captured in those films a little bit more directly. And yet they play it very seriously. Now, of course, in more recent films, we've seen the references to massive tsunamis. And yes, I'm aware that on the recent offerings of Netflix, I think there's a show set in La Palma at the Canary Islands. By the way, I plan to cover the Canary Islands soon, where they have a massive tsunami hitting it. Not to cause a spoiler, but if you look at the summary, it'll say that. Now, could something have happened that caused massive tsunamis? Is that part of what happened in the past? Is that a massive reset? Is that a hard reset? Or is that more something that's a lower scale reset? I suppose you could say it depends. If you have a tsunami that damages and destroys the coast, but the civilization survives, you could probably say it's a mid-level type of reset event. Yeah, it's going to cause massive changes to your society, but it's not going to completely destroy it or reorder it. And really, if you think about it, that's really what reset comes down to. Something is being reordered. But what we have to remember is it doesn't have to be the entire civilization. It doesn't have to be every component of it, from the shape of the lands to our lifespans. I mean, if you think about it, that's what a hard reset really does. Everything gets reordered. Uh, Probably best building on the entire island. Yeah, no doubt about it. uh, Tracy, I believe in biblical cosmology that speaks of seven domes, the firmaments, or the heavens. Just as viable a theory as any other. And, maybe that's fact. I don't know. I haven't been up there. I haven't been poking around through the domes, but yeah, that could be true. It does look like a dome. It does feel like a dome. So, Paul, yes, the island with Scarlett Johansson and Ewan McGregor, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Yeah, that's a good example too. I hate deep water. A lot of people have an intrinsic reluctance with deep water. Hey, New West Reset, thanks for joining us. Welcome. And Christine, always found it interesting that coastal natives don't have a tsunami oral history. Great attention to detail there, Christine. Yes, that is quite intriguing, isn't it? You don't tend to see that. It's either a massive flood or nothing. So who knows? Yes, I knew I had one image from Deep Impact. And these were at the times when such images were considered very shocking. You'd seen some of these images from the earlier movies, but officially special effects had improved from the 1960s to the 1990s. So these images looked a little bit more real, so to speak. Although what really looks real, I don't know. But you think about that with the entire mythology of the worldwide flood or the landwide flood and what would have been changed by that, how anybody even would have survived. And then you also think about other interesting artistic depictions of how the nature of the land was changed, whether it was rain or whether the very land was shifting under your feet. And then, of course, going back to the entire Sodom and Gomorrah attack by fire. What I've always found interesting, though, is that the fire raining down on it definitely seemed to match many other accounts that goes with other cultures, such as the account of what happened to quote unquote Death Valley. Yes, Death Valley. A great example, and a place where they have locations called Hell's Furnace. It's the high desert. There's also another very interesting high desert that's in South America that we'll be exploring in due time. But then you're really left with this. You think about how destructive this could have been, and this is how you explain a civilization being completely wiped away. But you don't have to wipe away all the physical evidence of it for a people not to be aware of it, as was displayed very accurately, I thought, in Logan's Run. If you have people that are confined to a particular area, a dome city, or maybe certain lands, and you can't reach other lands, maybe that's where the evidence is. It's just a possibility. I'm not saying that's what's really going on, but it's very interesting when you consider all those possibilities. Julia Barstow seems like Hell's Furnace. Well, based on that comment, I know you've been there, Julia. Yes, it does, doesn't it? So, anyways. Now, this is probably one of the more horrific art depictions that you tend to see. Now, is this to be taken literally or is this allegorically? And this is more akin to the medieval artwork that you would see. So is this something that's to induce fear in people, or is this something that's really just to try to keep you reluctant to an extent? This is really going far with the artwork that I'm showing death and fear and destruction. And it's probably one of the most horrific artistic takes on it that you can find. But then there's other ones where it's left a little bit more ambiguous, but you can see the destruction, people just falling to their death. And is it supposed to be the land completely changing, or is it people being consigned to something else? That's what you get in the artwork. And then, of course, looking at the Great Flood artwork as well, that there was a group of people who managed to survive on an ark with a group of animals. And, don't worry about the whole fact that never mind. I'm not going to go down that road, but what happens when your breeding pairs get very limited? It induces problems. If anybody saw the less than sufficient film Star Trek Insurrection, it was actually the studio heads that said, hey, wait a minute, 600 Baku, won't there be problems in a couple hundred years? There's also the same problem in the 1980 film Virus. Hey, wait a minute. There's only 800 people left alive in Antarctica. And by the way, only 8 of them are women. How's that going to work? You should watch the film if you're curious to see how they try to explain it. It's very fascinating. I'll leave it at that. Now, back to the original question about the shape of the lands. And we always bring it up, the whole depiction of California as an island. But to be honest, when we see these older maps, a lot of them are relatively close to our expectations for what the land looks like. But has that always been the case? Well, no, that has not always been the case, because if you go far enough back on a long enough timeline, we're informed by scientists. And remember, scientists always tell you the truth, and they can tell you what's a conspiracy and what's a conspiracy theory, as can historians. And what they say is that in the distant, distant past, depending on who you ask, 900 million years ago or 1 billion years ago, you had a single continent called Rodinia. Yes, most people think of Pangaea, but I found it interesting that there's more than one. Isn't it interesting that we knew exactly what was going on 900 million years ago or 1 billion years ago? We know that all the lands were together. But I want you to approach this from a different perspective. What if this wasn't so long ago? What if this was a lot more recent than we've been led to believe? Or than we even understand? It's not to say that we're being consciously deceived or misled. When people really believe something and that's the best evidence they have, well, it's possible that you could go off on the wrong tangent. Thoughts on that? Pangaea just means one world, doesn't it? Yeah, some also say it means one word. Don't ask me to explain that. So, Creator's Life, sure we did. Hey, thanks for that new West Reset. I appreciate it. And greetings to the new members. Warrior class. The Earth was teardrop shaped after being spit out from the sun. That's a very interesting one. I forgot about that one. Thanks for sharing that. But anyways, so possible that in the distant past that the layout of the land looked very different. You know what I find interesting though? It's the maps or the way they show this different look of the land on Earth. Supercontinent. Here. Amazonia, West Africa. East Antarctica. Siberia. Siberia was a separate landmass? Yeah, apparently so. North China was just out there floating around on its own. And the Congo. Laurentia, North America. Very intriguing. Makes you wonder, though, is there a little bit more something to this that might be more tangible? This is very specific for 750 million years ago. Long before human beings had officially developed any sort of intelligence or the capacity to communicate. Scientists believe they have found a fragment of it buried under the Indian Ocean. Oh, yes, of course. Madagascar. Okay, you say so. But very, very intriguing to think that the layout of the lands may have been very different. And if you think about that, maybe that was something that came between the resets, the hard resets of the eras. What if this really was the way the lands were laid out in, let's say, the third era or the fourth era in our 5 eras theory? Thoughts on that? Would that explain a lot of the inconsistencies that we tend to see if we think of the lands being laid out the same way that they are now? Samaria, I like that. What are your thoughts on that? The continents all fit together like puzzle pieces for sure. That is true. And you can really see that too. Yeah, jigsaw. You're right, Sean. And you can actually look at the lands. Now, are the lands being displayed accurately even on our current maps? Well, I don't know. I haven't flown at an altitude where I can visually verify that. Now, other people have. We have footage of it. And if you accept it, then yes, so be it. So, good comment there from Paul. It is a mystery. And there's still a lot of mysteries, contrary to what we think that we've solved all the mysteries. But, there's a lot of people who just don't like mysteries and, whether it frightens them or they're just reluctant to it. But moving on with these different views. Oh, this is this is an even more unique one here. Oddly enough, where all the land is on the outer edge, if you follow me. Quite fascinating. But then Laurentia is out here as its own island continent, Siberia and Baltica. That's intriguing. And then this line of islands. Now, maybe some of you have seen this map. I alluded to it before, but this is actually the map of the lands of Arda, or Middle Earth, which is thereabouts. You know, this, I think this is a map from the first or the second age. My Tolkien is, I need to review it a little bit, but just imagine, were it possible that there was a time that the lands on the very same land that we're on right now were laid out this way? That there's a great difference. The other interesting thing is Tolkien even talked about how the shape of the land could be changed. Granted, that was in his mythology, if you want to call it that. But I always found it fascinating that the very lands themselves could have been different in the distant past. Let's so RPG world map. Well, that's actually what inspired all the role-playing games, Sean. I mean, this is Arda right here. That's what inspired all of it. High fantasy. And who knows what inspired it? Unless, you know, Tolkien just made it all up and made up his own languages, and maybe he did. I can't prove that he didn't, but it's all very interesting. So anyway, that's it for reset type. Now let's take a look at reset frequency. How often do these resets actually happen? And of course, we're going to take a look back at the 5 eras theory, because I want to ask you that question. And when we did the live stream where we looked at the 5 eras, you know, we were trying to figure out how long each of the eras were. And the truth of the matter is we have no idea. We don't even know when the contemporary era ended. It's a guess. It's my best guess. I don't know. I could be wrong. It could be the 100-year reset. Heck, it could be a total reset every 5 minutes for all we know. Or it could be on a much longer timeline. We don't have any idea. But what's the actual time that each era consists of? And how frequent do these resets happen? Do they happen every 1,000 years, every 100 years, every 10,000 years, every 25,000 years? Of course, that's if a year is what we think of it as, right? Yep. Destruction. Every 138 years. Yes. Thank you, Brother Adam Bomb. I forgot the 138 years. Yeah. 116, 125, you know. Many different ones. But oddly enough, there are many depictions, many different calendars that give us the impression that somebody may know the cycles or have an idea of the cycles. You may have heard of the Yuga cycle, the 24,000 year cycle. Now, of course, the different religions have their different views on what the actual calendar is. I'm quite fascinated that apparently they don't necessarily agree, or maybe they do. But the interesting thing about the Yuga cycle, if you haven't heard of it, is it views things very differently. Now, for the record, I'm not going to do a deep dive on this because we'd be here all night if we talked about the Yuga cycles. This is just a broad overview. This is just to show you that there is a view of cycles out there within major religions and the mythology of them. Now, what's really intriguing to me about the Yuga cycles, though, is you have different natures of vibrational energy that's introduced into humanity. So you've got the initial cycle where everything is light, high vibration, 100% light. So everything is wondrous. Maybe that's one way to think of it. And then as time goes on in the next yuga or the next cycle, lower vibrational energy, 75% light, 25% darkness. And then you've got the 50-50. Light is more covered. War, power, and greed begin. And then you have the Kali Yuga, where it focuses on material world, overworld of spirit, disease, war, evil, 25% light, 75% darkness. Now, what would you all be naturally expected to say or think? That this one is the earlier era, the first era or second era, depending. I mean, here you're looking at 4. And then as time goes on, you get closer to our contemporary age, or where we are now, focuses on the material world over the spirit world, 25% light, 75% darkness. There's only a few individuals, or only within each individual, a little bit of that light. But for the most part, we succumb to the darkness. We're angered by jealousy. We're angered by anything that doesn't seem right to us, and therefore we have to impose our own form of justice, the infuriating nature of justice, instead of living in balance. Now, yes, I'm doing a very broad summary of this. We could talk about each of these for days, quite frankly. There's a lot of detail. And yes, if you're asking, I will be getting into this in the future. But right now, I'm just showing this to give you the idea that, yes, there are other cycles out there, that there are other ways of looking at things. And oddly enough, this one, 24,000 years life cycles of Earth, it's rather close to the Mayan long count calendar. How fortuitous, even though we're talking about two cultures that are on completely opposite sides of the land or opposite sides of the globe, depending on how you look at it. It doesn't really matter. They're in completely different areas. And yet somehow they're very close on how they look at the life cycles. And so, is there something behind that that shows that there's a little bit more reality? And if you know these cycles, if you're aware of them, is it possible? Hey, B. Hendricks, yeah, reading the tree rings. Is it possible that you could have an awareness or someone could have an awareness of what the cycle really is? That you know when a hard reset's going to happen, whatever it really is. Oh, Atom Bomb. Is it a cycle or a pendulum or both? A wobble? Could well be, Brother Adam. It does seem like it's a wobble at some time. So, Kitch, if we go directly from Cali, it might explain catacombs, mud, floods. Yes, beyond any shadow of a doubt, it would, wouldn't it? And Sean P, creation and destruction. All the time, my friend, all the time. Now, this is probably a little bit more of the visual representation of it, and granted, we're talking about tens of thousands of years of history here, so that's why I'm not going to dive into it yet. But if you step far enough back and you look at how all this is laid out, you suddenly see the same things. The same cycles repeat in many different civilizations and cultures across the land, where everything went from the concept of a dark city. And when we get to Dark City, we'll talk about how fast these resets can really happen. But think about the past if there was a much higher form of technological advancement achieved that we can't even begin to imagine. Now, of course, people will deride you and say, oh, it's just science fiction. There's no way it happened. Well, you can't really prove much of anything from 1899 right now. I mean, yes, we have records, but that's all we have. There's nobody you can talk to anywhere who can tell you that they even witnessed the year 1899 firsthand. That's just one example. So is it possible that we're on one of these cycles? Now, this particular symbol, again, referencing another film that I thought got cycles down perfectly, the Dark Crystal, the original Dark Crystal with the Great Conjunction, the alignment of the celestial object of the three suns. And it was during the Great Conjunction that a hard full reset could happen. And if you're familiar with the story of the Dark Crystal and the origin story, it was actually the Great Conjunction. That was when the Urskeks, the amazing beings, came from another world. And then they were separated into the Skeksis and the Uriks, or the Mystics, depending on how you want to call them. And then, of course, it was during another Great Conjunction when they managed to heal the Dark Crystal. And then it caused another reset. Wonderful film, The Dark Crystal. So much myth all tied into it. A lot of people say there's a little bit more than just the myth tied into it. We covered it when we did Old World in Film at the end of this last summer. But I always thought that the alignment of the celestial objects, the three suns, very intriguing. The Great Conjunction, or all three, and oddly enough, when you look at it, it does sort of look like an eye in the sky. Huh, isn't that interesting? What are the odds, huh? Planet X, that's a good one, Robert. I'd forgotten about that one. Hey, Polly, good to see you. And begin all the same. Big change. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Probably a great way to summarize it there, Polly. Dark Crystal had more symbology than David Bowie's movie Labyrinth had. Yeah, Dark Crystal had a lot more, how shall we say, high concept symbolism in it. Whereas David Bowie's movie, it had a little bit more direct symbolism in it, but both were good in their own way, I thought. So, Oh, yes. Anyway, so the Great Conjunction, But then there's also other indications, even in the more recent medieval artwork that we have, that show you that something happened in the past. Very strange events that's oddly enough reflected in the art, where we see entire cities on fire. We see people either being killed or dragged away. What's that representing? Is that representing the time right after the reset occurred, when there were smaller resets that were occurring? And then, in line with the Yuga cycle, we have the Mayan long count calendar. And of course, it was referenced quite a bit with 2012, although who knows the accuracy of that date. And if you're not familiar with the Mayan long count calendar, it's quite intriguing with the way the time is broken up and how they're actually counting time on a much greater scale than we're typically used to. I mean, you think about it, they talked about on 21st December, 12 years ago, the Mayan era ends. But was that correct, or was that just something else we were saying? Some experts say December 23rd. Yeah, of course not. Couldn't agree on that one. But interesting apparatus, though, and interesting depictions that show how time is really being counted. Now, here's something else I want to run by you. Is it possible that maybe somebody somewhere or something somewhere has some sort of device, some sort of apparatus that's along these lines, perhaps something even grander, where they could really count the actual cycles and really understand exactly when the next hard reset's going to happen? Now, of course, this is the theory that the hard reset is a natural event. There's no control over it, but if you know when it's going to happen, you can arrange things that you can really have the ability to take advantage of the situation. Now, maybe not. Maybe nobody knows. And maybe that's part of it. You know, there are some signs that show us that there was some awareness of somebody actually being able to survive a hard reset, but maybe there wasn't. The people and the lands were completely rearranged and they had no awareness. Although we're going to cite an example when we talk about reset outcomes where you don't have to reorder the entire civilization and yet people can still completely lose awareness. We'll get to it. But just think about that. Some amazing calendar somewhere, some incredible apparatus that's a long count calendar like this that's tracking every single day, even now. Ah, Brother Atom Bomb, the looking glass. Yes. Reading my mind again. When I was little, I thought the Capitol in Madison, Wisconsin caused noon to happen. I called it the Capitol Noon. Oh, that's cool. Hey, Sooner West, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Well, you know, and Sean, maybe that's just what we're informed that they are. Maybe there's something completely different, but we're just told they're solar flares. Who knows for sure? Ah, yes, the underground cities, the AMP people. Exploration coming out soon on that one. Although there's multiple different concepts in terms of the underground and what it could be. Does anybody remember what this is and where this is? Let's see. Plasma events. Yeah, and Julia, maybe that's really what a solar flare actually is. Gigantic plasma event. So your replacements are waiting. Disturbing thought, but entirely possible. Ah, I am Kairos. Yes. Prague, the Prague clock. Prague in the Czech Republic. And if you watch any film from before 1989, they'll say Czechoslovakia, but Czech Republic in Prague. The astrological clock. Indeed. Now, the reason I'm showing this clock is this goes on in that example of some sort of device that's actually counting a real calendar. How accurate are our current clocks? And of course, we see that we actually have an IV on this one. Although the question I'm going to ask you is, has this clock been renovated over time? And I think you know the answer. You know, is this the original clock as it were, or has it been changed? You know, because don't we get around to changing everything? Renovation? The smaller form of a reset, if you will, the renovation. Because aren't we always doing renovation without fail? Marlowe. Yes, the doomsday clock. Oddly enough, that's still referred to this day. You know, a lot of people thought it was a little bit of an instrument to inflict fear during the Cold War, but they still refer to the doomsday clock. Creator's Life. I don't know, but original clockmakers really knew how to keep time. Yeah, they really give that impression, don't they? And maybe they did, and maybe they had more effective devices that could keep track of time. Why is it we still struggle with it to this day? And so it goes on to that question. Could there be different types of clocks? Could there be other means of actually measuring this cycle? You know, we like to say that time and the perception of time is made up, but maybe there's something even beyond that, the actual concept of time, but the relation of when certain events are really going to happen, if they do happen. Or again, it could all be an artificial construct, time being imposed upon us, a little reset in and of itself, if you will. And then, of course, there's the 5 human generations from classical Greece, where we have our Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, the Age of Heroes, and the Iron Age. Oddly enough, corresponding with the 5 eras theory, of course, inspiring the 5 eras theory quite directly. And oddly enough, also, the same state of humanity declining over time and becoming something much more materialistic, much more short lived. Also reflected in the great works of religious myth. Everybody seems to agree that in the past, human beings were more spiritual. Human beings lived much longer. Human beings were more in balance with their natural environment. And that's not a plug line, merely stating that they were. And then as time went on, that descended. And eventually we're in the state that we are now. Again, it's all a theory, but it's awfully strange that every single culture seems to agree upon it, despite all of our many differences that we have. We seem to agree upon these things, and maybe that's just a great coincidence. Creator's Life, Time of the Gods, or Finding Knowledge by the Few. Yeah, maybe so. Oh. Doesn't want to read my prophetic and intelligent comments. Well, I just did right there. All right, so moving on from reset frequency, let's talk about reset outcome. Now, you might be interested to understand what we're talking about with reset outcome. And I'm going to start with something you may be very familiar with. Now, you might not have seen this, but this is actually the original poster that came out with the film The Terminator, the original film that came out 40 years ago, oddly enough. Now, yes, of course, this is a altered poster, but the original poster, when we thought about The Terminator, you think about the entire plot of the original film and how it's really a time loop that happens, and talking about the relationship with events of the future affecting events in the past. There's an old saying, and you honestly come across it when you look at different older series. It's been completely dropped. And what that saying is in the past lies what is to come. You hear that stated all the time. So is that referencing a cycle, or is that referencing the fact that we're trapped in a sequence of events, not necessarily a cycle? Or are they the same thing? I always found it so interesting, though, that idea was really poked at in the original Terminator movie. And, you know, I still think it's, one of the best ones, but that's just my opinion. Make of it what you will. Of course, I thought you were serious, because everybody is serious when they talk here. It's okay not to be serious, though. Golden Age of Enlightenment, of Light in Lucifer. And I'm sure there's many serious comments made about that, about how the name of this channel is so close to that, right? It's okay. I'm in one of those moods tonight, so don't mind me. Now, reset outcome. Let me make sure I've got that up. Yep, okay. Now, this is from the film The Animatrix. This is the animated film that followed The Matrix. A lot of people said that perhaps they should have made this into a film instead of Matrix Reloaded. I don't know, just an opinion. I just heard it from some people. And the Animatrix displayed the second renaissance when the machines or the sentient AI, back when AI was what artificial intelligence really was, and not just some deep learning program that we have now that can make images and video for us. Maybe it'll come to that again. But anyway, science fiction concept of AI, just so nobody's confused. And the terrifying concept that human beings were reordered as a power source for the machines, displayed early on here with the larger scale machines that overwhelmed the armies of humanity in the Animatrix. So that's one concept of a reset outcome, where you have the entire society, the order of it, it's been completely changed. Now, here's another way to think of this that we don't consider. The implementation of the pocket watch. And I've said a couple times to people that I work with and research with, the pocket watch was really the original smartphone. It was a device you always carried with you all the time, and it just told you the time. But you think about it, and this is a Waltham. This is actually a railroad pocket watch. So this is one of the best pocket watches they had because you had to keep the railroads right on time to make sure that your train didn't crash into another train, or to make sure that you showed up to your meeting on time when your railroad had declared bankruptcy. Anyways, but think about that. People went from carrying nothing to suddenly everybody was carrying a pocket watch. And if you think about that, that's continued to this day, where now we all have these wonderful phones that we carry with us everywhere we go. Well, everybody had a pocket watch with them back in the day. So think about that kind of reset outcome. All of a sudden now, you have a society that is now controlled by this tighter concept of time. KC, yes, because they got rid of the bells. Absolutely. No doubt about it. Creator's life. I will tell my own time. Yeah, it's probably the best way to approach it, too. No joke. But the other interesting thing, and of course the Waltham compound and the story of the Waltham Watch Company might be something that we'll cover in the future. But you think about that, how they were suddenly producing all of these pocket watches for everybody to carry. So a bit of a reset outcome. Time is now being imposed. But it's not a hard reset. It's more of what you would think of as a smaller scale reset. And even if you're still using the same time, you're talking about people now being controlled or guided, depending on how you want to phrase it, by time more directly. Now, specific time matters. I'm a farmer. The sun comes up. It's time to do my chores. The sun goes down and I'm done. Everything's by daylight and night. So time matters, but it doesn't matter to the detail. Well, now I've got my Waltham Railroad chronometer on my person at all times, and I have its time set perfectly because I need to make sure that the track switches right at 9:14. If I miss it, there's going to be a head-on collision. That's how it all started, and it's continued to this day. Now, you look at all the images that we have of this city destruction, all these fires that occurred, and I know I'm on shaky ground right here, but, is this exactly what we were told, or was this the remnants of what had come before? Or was this what was happening after the last reset when there was another series of small scale resets that were happening? Other buildings were being destroyed. People were being ordered into a new society. Conflict, assimilation, indoctrination was occurring. Now, there's many different theories. Now, of course, I don't know. I wasn't there. But it is rather odd that we do have this recurring story that happens in all the great cities across the land, not just the ones in the United States. Now they tell us the Great London Fire happened in 1666. Great year for that. But some of these images really do make you wonder because you see levels of destruction that are rather odd and strange. And you see images that show very unique and strange things. And yet we can find more contemporary images that look a lot like this, can't we? Without much effort. Yes. No, it was definitely not just the cities. We have the images of the cities, but don't forget the Peshtigo fire in the great land of Wisconsin, which apparently happened on the exact same day as the Chicago fire in the 1870s. So really the fires could be anywhere and everywhere. Great point, though. Thanks, Sabotage Shelfie. What's that, Paulie? Apocalypse also translates to revelation. That's true. But is that a literal translation or is that someone playing word games and connections with words? That's what I've always wondered. But you see things like this, the entire reset outcome. And here I'll go to another example that gets overlooked. The original film, Westworld. Now, yes, everyone's more familiar with the more contemporary TV series that came out in 2016, which, by the way, I thought the first season of it was an incredible series. And then after that, I'm not sure what happened, but don't ask me. Maybe you enjoyed the following seasons, and that's all right. I just stopped following it. But the original film was interesting because of all that was implied in the original film. The original film, it wasn't just Westworld. There was a Roman world, Pompeii, and then I'm trying to remember what was the other one. There was another one. Oh, I think it was Middle Ages, medieval world. So you had Westworld, medieval, and Rome. But here's something else that's hidden in this film that will not be readily apparent to you. Oddly enough, this matches the same things that were shown at the expositions. In other words, they were giving people the idea of what their history really was. It was being spelled out for you. Well, how do I know what happened in Rome? Well, go watch the Roman TV series on HBO with Kevin McKidd from the day when he played, never mind, Lucius Vorenus. Okay. But what you saw in this film, though, was this concept of a society that doesn't know what its past really is, but has it introduced to it in this play center where you have robots that are role playing these roles, but they've been programmed. But it's not the genuine article. So, did Rome really happen? Or is it all just a conceptualization to explain something? Is that the very definition of an ideological reset? In other words, historical revision. Is historical revision a concept which does happen, which is well documented, which is an official process in academic history? Is that a reset? Did Ken Burns, when he made the film Civil War and released it in 1990, did that change the way that not just Americans, but people across the land looked at the United States Civil War? And was there a reason for that? Thoughts? Yul Brynner. Oh, yes. The original android that went rogue. And I strongly advise that if you can, watch the original movie. I mean, I know it's dated, but there's some very interesting ideas in it. There's a lot of, how shall we say, old world references that are very, very subtle in it. And it does give the idea that, yes, maybe if we have an exposition, if you have the technology, you can give people a completely different idea of what the past looked like. Now, on the note of smaller scale reset, the film Dark City from 1999, and I've reviewed this one as well, with this concept of these aliens or these outsiders or these strangers, whatever you want to think of them as. They could be anything, they could be nothing, actually doing experiments on human beings because they have total control over this city. They can inject new memories into people's minds. And this is also an idea that you saw in the film Blade Runner. Hold on, I'll get to that in a second. But Dark City is probably one of the best examples in a film for how resets can happen every 12 hours. Everything is reset. The city remains the same, but people's identities could be changed. People can have new memories put in their minds where they're murderers. The entire dynamic can change. Now, I strongly recommend the film. You can see what they're really going after. And this was a very interesting film because nobody really saw this in theaters. It didn't really seem to get pushed. It was kind of like Dune from 1984. But then when it hit the VHS shelves, everybody made a run on it. So no, it was definitely not like Death Wish 5 where we had to pull it off the shelves because nobody was renting it and more people were renting Death Wish 4 and Death Wish 3. Yeah, Charles Bronson call out there. But anyway, it was really intriguing though. As soon as Dark City came out, everybody was renting it and talking about it. One of those films that gained life. The director also had a very interesting career as well. And he did another film with old Nicolas Cage called Knowing in the late 2000s. That's another interesting one. But I highlight Dark City because I think it's got the best examples of showing multiple resets happening every single day and what that might look like. Like a Cenobite army in Star Trek Nemesis. Yeah, I guess that's one way to look at it. All around that time frame. So, oh, there you go. Night is day to them, they say. Yeah, that's right. Because in Dark City, that's why it's called Dark City. It's always night, but nobody can remember that it's always night. Good point there, Vaughn. Forgot to call that out. Hey, Eric. Yeah, it does have a Hellraiser aesthetic to it, doesn't it? Very, very true. But that's one of the examples that I think that shows you that there's different sorts of reset outcomes. So it doesn't have to be the outcome where the entire civilization is reordered from top to bottom. It could be something a lot more direct. And yes, it could actually affect a single individual. It's frightening, but it's all entirely possible. And so these are examples of it. Now, something else I want to show you. One of the things we talk about is the highway system. Now, here we're looking at the interstate system in the United States. One of the things we don't think about is what are the actual age of the roads? And I know that was one of the very early exploration ideas. In fact, I think it was one of the very first videos that John Levi covered when he talked about how old is the infrastructure of the roads. Is there a big indicator there? Now, the official history tells us that the Eisenhower interstate system was developed in the United States after President Eisenhower was in Germany and he saw the Autobahn and wanted an Autobahn in the United States. Yep, it makes sense. Make people more reliant on their individual automobiles, as Worf would say. But oddly enough, looking at this, is this the original system or did we have something else? Well, you had the highway system that preceded it. And does anybody know when was the highway system established officially in the United States? Going off the official historical account here. Winnipeg equals Rome. Hey, you never know. It just might. 1930s. You're close there, New West Reset. Officially, it was the 1920s when the U.S. highway system was established. And then the interstate system started in the 50s, and then it continued to this day. Now, would anybody like to see an original state map? An original state map. Hey, Towns, thanks for that. Yeah, fancy tearing that down. Well, all in 30 years, exactly, Vaughn. A very rapid amount of time. So let's take a look at a map of a state that was done during this construction of the highway system. So let me get this up here. Stop screen. Okay, here we go. Now, what we're looking at here, this is the state map of Wisconsin. Official highway map of Wisconsin. Now, yeah, we're going back to Wisconsin because it's a great example. And what you have on here, this map is purported to be from 1927. So in 1927, and just to go over the legend real quick, any hard line, any straight line, that's part of the U.S. highway system. It's surfaced with concrete. Anything else is surfaced with materials other than concrete, largely gravel, or it's less than that. Now, oddly enough, when you look at Wisconsin, and remember, Chicago is right here. So Wisconsin's not exactly the boondocks here. It's not isolated. Yeah, Bill Murray makes that joke in the film Stripes about it. Hey, it's like going into Wisconsin. Oh, going into Czechoslovakia when it was Czechoslovakia. It's like going into Wisconsin. Yeah, great line there. But you'll notice that most of the highway system is around the major cities. Milwaukee. But oddly enough, the state capital, Madison, it's all dirt roads going into Madison. Hey, wait a minute. What gives? They had that beautiful state capitol that they'd built long before this, and yet they didn't have hard surface roads. And if you look at the way all the way up to La Crosse and then up to St. Paul and Minneapolis, it's all gravel roads. But then, oddly enough, Milwaukee, yeah, we kind of expect that, hard surface roads. But then going up here to the Fox Cities, as it's called, Oshkosh, and then up here, Appleton, Willem Dafoe's hometown. You'll notice, though, that they're all hard surface roads all the way up to Green Bay. I'll be darned. Were they already driving up there to watch the Packers all the time, even though the Packers had only been around for a few short years? Or is there something else going on here? Is this really showing the roads as they were constructed? Or is this giving us a clue that maybe these roads were already there and that this was really showing the states of repair? And really what you're seeing is the effects of the last reset. Thoughts on this? Yes, 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 yes. Kathy, strips where they made Louisville, Kentucky look like NYC. Ever so true. I am Kairos. Gravel, asphalt, concrete production at levels we cannot comprehend. All mining. Exactly. And this is actually some clues that really show you this. There's a mound in Stoughton, Wisconsin in the cement. We used to sled there. Oh, yes. Hmm. Oshkosh, of course, mining town. Maybe. But there's mining towns in other places too. Someone mentioned the Upper Peninsula. Let's take a look at that. Hold on. What do we got up there? So, yeah, virtually nothing up in the Upper Peninsula, at least Wisconsin. Now, we don't know what the condition of these roads are. We assume, I mean, they're designated as highways, but why are they designated as highways if they're just gravel? Guess you're not going up to northern Wisconsin easily at these times. Yet, oddly enough, all the way up here in Duluth, at the end of Lake Superior, you do have these hard surface roads. So it's really interesting that there's not more of the hard surface roads that are running up that way at that time. I mean, there's a couple areas, but, here by Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls, they've got a couple, but then they just end. Nothing going to La Crosse either at that time, but we know what a major city La Crosse was. Oh, look, on the contrary, and by Sparta. So what does really make more sense? They were building out from these random towns in the middle of nowhere at the time. Now, of course, we'll be told, yes, they were just improving the wagon trails. Well, maybe. But oddly enough, these highways and these roads still run these same paths to this day. So it's really, really odd. And it's not something that's so easy to document as you might think. You would expect it to be. Yeah, the lumber industry. And you're going to drive your initial heavy trucks on gravel roads because that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, possible. But you can find maps of any states. You can also compare the layout of the roads in states and how much that changes. So it's really, really strange. Oh, what was that comment there? Oh, yeah. I mean, in the population dispersion, that doesn't make any sense either with how they were doing these roads. So, but it's getting more difficult to find these original maps and what they were actually showing us. So, is this giving us a clue of what was happening in the past? Was this an indicator that there was a bit of a reset with this? That what we had were roads that just simply needed to be resurfaced, but they were already there. The infrastructure was already there. It's very, very odd. We're still informed that, yes, the Roman roads were always there and they're always in pristine condition. Those roads that were built 2,000 years ago. But there was nothing in the United States. There were just wagon trails. But yeah, I go to Milwaukee and we've got everything with a nice concrete highway right away. But you go to Madison, sorry. You just have these two right here and that's it. Then once you get outside of town a little bit, it's all gravel roads. You want to go up to Baraboo or up to Wisconsin Dells, it's all gravel roads in your Model T. Have a nice day. And, this is 1927. Quite fascinating. Yeah, exactly, Heidi. Were they mud, though? That's the interesting thing about it. Really thinking about that. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. Maybe something was destroyed up there. So, paving, tar, and brick factories everywhere. And don't forget, labor everywhere. Elusive truths. Millions upon millions of bricks were shipped on these roads. Exactly. Bricks, columns, foundation blocks, everything. KC933, what if AI plans this out and orchestrates the resets every time? That's a theory as well, and a very strong one. So, in summary, what are these resets? Are they planned events? To an extent, it seems like there is planning that goes before and after them. But are the hard resets actually planned? There seems to be indications that no, they weren't. They didn't need hard roads. They all used their airships. Yeah, quite possible. Or maybe they just had a smaller ground transportation that was a little bit more viable. They had trolleys. So why bother with roads, right, if you have trolleys? But yet we have signs that there are more designed roads. So it's another one of those conflicting accounts. We just don't know. We have signs of both. Or maybe the road system was something that they did implement and develop right after the reset. There you go, Christine. An explanation to ease the dissonance. And isn't it funny? That's all it takes. A single, simple explanation. Yeah. And you know what, Punchy? You can find rails everywhere to this day as well. Rails and trolleys and pictures and indications that they were in every small town all across the entire Midwest, including Wisconsin. Nothing against Wisconsin, so. But anyway, that's the thing to keep in mind with resets. So hard resets that can make the world very different, but then you've got the smaller micro resets, if you will. Oh, thanks, New West Reset. I appreciate that. And cheers to you. And Merry Christmas to you as well, my friend. But that's really one of the baseline components of alternative research theory, that there are different outcomes from a reset. And people can argue that resets are continuing to this day. Why? Why do they lie to us, though? Well, why does anybody lie? Start with that question. What does anybody gain by lying? And what do you gain by lying to other people who think that they know the truth and then spread the truth to others? There's a reason why I always say I don't know, because I don't know. I would be lying if I said I know. I don't know. And like I always say, the mainstream account could be correct, but it seems less and less likely with every exploration. This map is yet another clue. There you go, Sean. Incremental removal of the old world. And not just removal of the physical evidence, but also from the conscience of people. And one final thing I'll leave you with before we break tonight is think about the entire concept of how you have things such as the silent generation. What were people like in the previous generations? Were they like us, where we're inquisitive, where we're asking these kind of questions, where we're allowed to? Or were they the silent generation? And was that really just limited to the generation that came right before World War II, the greatest generation? Or was that every generation that came before? In other words, they were practicing silence is golden, or silence is required for survival. Because you ask people about earlier times and they just don't talk about it. Now, it's not to say everybody's like that, but the entire mentality and the reputation is silence. Yeah, there you go, Polly. Or talk about it, and that's where you end up. You get your little relocation. We've got a special place for you. It's not an asylum, it's a school. It's not a school, it's a reservation. It's not a reservation, it's a soldier's home. We got many different names for it, but that's where you're going to go. Well, and you think about that, Jared. I mean, people are intelligent. They're not just going to go walk right into their grave. And, if you see people that you know, or you're aware of people that you know, hey, they talked about the fact that there's a big, huge dome building in Madison, Wisconsin, and they got taken away the next day. I'm not going to say anything about it. And then the next thing you know, it gets disseminated across the entire population. Don't talk about it. Don't pay attention to it. And now the next thing you know, all of us can walk right through the state capitol in Madison in Des Moines as children and not pay any attention to it. Oh, it's just another building. It's been there all the time. It's well documented. Because there's nobody else who says otherwise, so it's got to be true, right? It's recorded, but nobody can actually give you a firsthand account of its origin. Yeah, there you go. The old prisons, as we probably, yeah. No doubt about it. And why do we have a reputation of having so many people in prisons even to this day in these lands of freedom and opportunity? I don't know. I mean, that's up to you. And no, that doesn't seem to change with never mind. I'm not going to finish that thought. You can see it yourself. So Mass formation psychosis. Indeed, indeed. Backed up by a little bit of authority, and that's all you need. Yeah, there you go with a real story. And if you keep making trouble at the asylum, you'll be buried there. And there are great large cemeteries at all the asylums. Some are still marked, some aren't. You're right, Sydney. We are the children of the silent generation and the boomers. Well, and that's one of the final points right there, Kitch. How long does social engineering really take? Does it even take one generation? Or if you have the ability to pull enough strings, if you have enough ability to induce enough micro resets, can social engineering occur on a much shorter timeline? Can it happen literally overnight or in the span of a few weeks or a month? Well, yeah, exactly. Don't talk about Fight Club. And, my memory's not so good these days. I don't remember what happened 4 years ago. So maybe nobody else does either. And that's okay. Anyway, what are your thoughts on resets? Good exploration topic? Something that we could go back to in the future at some point? Oh, that's a good one, Barbara. Relative of Kaiser Wilhelm would only talk about it after downing a few, but was scared. That's the interesting thing. It's hard to find people who are willing to talk of that time frame at all. Yeah, there you go, Polly. Happens all the time. Oh, Casey. Well, and is it mind control, or is it also just the idea to be a servile flatterer? Where does control end and the desire to conform begin? That's a good question, too. All right. Ooh, Julia S. Poor memory is a feature of the Kali Yuga. Very true. Because we've lost our touch with our own individual spirituality, and therefore our memories diminish. Great point. Oh, what's that from I'm Kairos? I saw melted bricks, reset evidence. Yeah, but a lot of people just go right past it, not think twice of it. They're just old, right? They're old. That doesn't prove anything. They're just old. That's why they're melted. Oh my goodness. Yeah, there you go. Any blabbing about airships or showing them in any pictures, right, Sean? There you go. All right, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed this topic. It was a good one to cover, and I think it's important to understand as it's one of the pillar topics for how we explain the existence of previous civilizations and why we have no awareness. It answers that question of how this could be done. It's important to understand how it could be done. And now we still work on the questions. Well, why was it done? When was it done? Who did it? And I intend to get after that a little bit. And I know I haven't really covered so much who did it. We've got our ancient enemy exploration, but look for an exploration coming up next week. There's not going to be a live stream next Saturday, but there will be an exploration released at the exact same time that will cover the who behind all this. So, well, I hope you enjoyed the live stream. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And you all have a great week, a great holiday, wherever you are. Merry Christmas, if that's your thing. And, we all have our own traditions, and we're all our own people, and that's what makes us special. But thank you for being here, and I wish you all well. And I hope you have a great week and a happy solstice. At least I forget that. So this is Lucius Aurelian signing off. Thank you for joining me.